I loved coming to Tasmania. I cemented my marriage here in Tasmania. Is that the word? That's a mainland term, I think. I had my honeymoon in Tasmania. And I've loved coming back ever since, and I think it's true to say that you certainly live in the most beautiful state of Australia. The sheer visual sensuality of Hobart, I think, leaves every other state for dead. Could be a bit warmer sometimes, but absolutely magnificent. I also want to celebrate the work of neighbourhood houses since the mid-1980s. Your passion, and you can sense the passion in this room, your work, whether you're managers, coordinators, staff or volunteers, really is part of the glue that holds together society. We are in a pretty fragile place in the world at the moment. It feels like the edge is closer, that this sense of madness, populist authoritarianism around the world is sweeping us, maybe turning us inwards. And the glue that actually says, no, this really is what counts, are people who volunteer, who serve. No government's told them they have to volunteer. No one's paying them to volunteer. This comes from somewhere deep. It comes from a sense of commitment to others, which is why I call it the glue that actually holds us together. Well, having a look at your report, amazing testimonies, how you connect with the disconnected, how people have found safe places where they're cherished and understood, where friendships are formed. I think humans by nature are made for community. I could give you a religious view of this. What Trinity means in Christian faith is really a community God. And if we're made in the image of that God, the truest thing we can say is we're made for community. If you're not religious, there's sense that we're mammals. When we're cut off from the herd, we feel panic, we feel anxiety. Actually belonging to others is so primary and primal that fragmenting communities provoke great anxiety in us. I've discovered some of the depths of this communitarian thought by watching that great academic film, Crocodile Dundee. There's Mick in a bar in America, and he's blown away that every American he talks to has a therapist. And he scratches his head and he wonders and says, "What's wrong with you people? Don't you have mates? Why do you all need counsellors?" And the American says, "If you Aussies don't have counsellors, how do you solve your problems?" And Mick thinks for a moment and says, "Well, I guess at Walkabout Creek, where I come from, if you've got a problem, you go to the local pub, Wally the publican's behind the bar. Over a drink, you end up telling Wally your problem. Wally ends up telling the whole bar the problem. And soon, no more problem." Well, that's a terrible counselling technique. Don't ever do that. But there is a germ of truth. The truth is that our problems are usually relational and communal. A good counsellor listens to us in depth. They don't solve our problems. And in listening, they say, do you need to forgive? Do you need to confront? Do you need to draw a line in the sand? You have done everything possible just by listening. But because we're made for relationship, because we're communal beings, when we carry the problems alone, this intensifies anxiety. You know, Mother Teresa famously said, "Loneliness is the leprosy of the West." She really was saying that even in poverty, and I see this in my World Vision work, whether it's India or Africa or elsewhere, there is celebration and solidarity with others. You're never really alone. It's terrible, poverty. I won't romanticise it. It's terrible. but you're never actually left alone. In the West, the poverty of spirit where we feel alone because everybody's so busy. Everyone's with 24/7 media and social platforms. Fine, you can have communities on social platforms, but I'm old, I'm a dinosaur still walking the earth. I know I should be extinct, but as a dinosaur, I say you can never really experience community on social platforms. You need to see someone, touch someone, see the expressions, listen to the tone in the voice, preferably get a hug and feel that you matter. That question that every human has, do I matter? Do I actually matter? I think it's that primal question, and it is only answered, I think, in community. Why you as volunteers I admire so much is for this reason. To give up time is actually to give up the scarcest resource humans have. All we actually ever have in life is time. We're all allocated a certain number of hours. It's why when someone wastes our time, they're actually a thief, aren't they? It's why when someone voluntarily gives us our time, not because they're being paid, not because government's ordered them to do it, when they voluntarily give their time, this is really one of the greatest gifts, the most profound gifts. I expect and have seen in neighbourhood houses this, that people have known, maybe for the first time, that they're not alone, that the pain they experience is being shared. That's what community is about. It doesn't take away the pain, it can't always solve the problems, they might be social, economic, you might have all sorts of prejudice, but sharing the pain is profoundly important to our sense of dignity. We aren't alone, we share this pain. This has been my experience in all my community work, both locally and globally. There are very few people you cannot love when you actually hear their story. When you actually take the time and hear the story and you go, so it's about that. In one of my first books, I remember talking about my first legal client back in St Kilda. She walked into my office, I'd set up a legal office, happened to be in the Baptist church where I was the Baptist minister. It was a bit odd to have a legal office in a church, but there we go. As soon as she walked in, I didn't actually have to inquire about her occupation. The way she was dressed gave it away. She said, are you a lawyer? I said, yes. She told me she was charged with the purposes of loitering for the purposes of prostitution. I reached for my diary. I said, yep, sure. When's the case on? I'll never forget this. She looked at her watch and said, in 5 minutes' time. I threw on my suit coat. The court, St Kilda Magistrates Court, was around the corner. I said, let's go. We don't want a warrant out for your arrest. As we walked, I was asking about the nature of the offence. I couldn't help but notice a big black eye. So ugly, I assumed she'd been bashed. I said to her, are you okay? And she said, yeah. If you're worried and think I've been bashed, she said, no, I haven't. She said, I'm prostituting because I'm a heroin addict. With all my long list of priors, I reckon I'm going inside. Yesterday, I thought this will be my last hit of heroin for a long time. I want to make it a good hit. She said, I got frustrated that I couldn't find a vein in my arm, so I shot up behind my eye. I remember freaking. I didn't know people did this, and I was judging her. We got to court, crowded court, case called, I put a plea, managed to keep her out of prison. She got a community-based order. And she was so thrilled, so sure she was going to prison, in front of a crowded court, she threw her arms around me, planted a kiss on my cheek, and said, "That's fantastic. Let me take you out to lunch." It's funny in that split second when you're thinking of how you're going to answer, which voices you hear in life. I heard my mother's voice. I've learned it doesn't matter really what age you are, even what continent of the earth you're on, your mother still gets to you. I heard her say, "Timothy, you're known by the company you keep." It was something she drummed into us. I knew she was saying decline the invitation. I also heard another voice. It was the voice of conscience. God, what are you scared of? Is it your reputation? Well, it was. I didn't think it was a great way to start a legal practice, dining with a sex worker. It wasn't a great way to start a Baptist ministry, for that matter. So, heart in mouth, I said, "That's great. Thank you. All right, let's go to lunch. Where do you want to go?" She said, "Oh, the Catholic church down the road puts on a great free lunch." I thought, damn, I'm caught. Well, the walk from St Kilda Magistrates Court to Grey Street, St Kilda, was literally through what was the red light area, still is in St Kilda. It was my education. And I remember judging her because she was pointing out how cars would turn at this corner and she'd stand there. How you got into a car with central locking, you didn't know if it was a psychopath. You didn't know if you're going to get raped. I remember her saying things that were news to me. It's mainly married men, by the way, that come by. That was news. And I was judging her, thinking, how could she do this? This is shocking. And then she said something that really dissolved my judgment. She said, well, when I was 15, one of the many men that came through my mother's life, that my mother thought she loved, he was at home and he raped me. I tried to tell Mum, and she didn't want to listen. She was in love, she thought, with this man. I felt so unsafe, I left. I went to a friend's house until my friend's mum said, has this kid moved in? I went to another friend's house. I then ran out of friends. And I was sleeping on the streets, not surviving, and I thought, well, if that's what men do, I'm going to at least make them pay. And I ended up working the streets. I remember all my judgments dissolving. I had no idea, coming from a loving, safe family. You may not think, knowing my siblings, that it's a loving, safe family, but, let me tell you it was. Coming from a safe background, who was I to judge? I think there are very few people we can't love. If not love, at least understand if we actually hear their story. Understand where they're coming from. This is the importance of Neighbourhood House, using activities, whether it's community garden, whether it's a play group, whatever it is, to have an entry point with activity to listen, to build trust, to say you matter. This is overcoming the fragmentation in community. It's reminding us that we are made for community, that loneliness is a killer, not to mention that it leads to a whole lot of other destructive things. One of the big influences in my life was my maternal grandmother, Mum's mum. She was a remarkable person, a foundation member of the Liberal Party, knew Robert Menzies, and she would have us over on weekends, have us cooking, which wasn't much fun when you're a 12-year-old boy. You'd be rather out playing footy or cricket. Always cooking far too much. Never knew why we had to be cooking. She would recite poetry for hours and try and get us to memorise it. She'd sponsor migrants out from Scotland. She was Scottish. Help them set up, write letters. I've still got a lot of the letters my grandma wrote to me, and yet she actually left school in grade 6. She probably is the most educated person I've ever met. And yet it was self-taught. Such was her motivation. Well, after church on Sunday and roast lunch, we would discover why we'd had to cook so much food. She would pack all the food into baskets, casseroles, whatever, cakes, and with us in train, head out into her local community. Lived in Murrumbina in Melbourne. And we'd leave a casserole with a note on someone's doorstep. Often a person she didn't personally know, but she'd heard they were doing poorly. That was her word. They were doing poorly. And I remember saying to Grandma, why are we doing this? I must admit, I didn't really enjoy it. But she was such a force of nature, you did it. She'd say, well, Tim, this is what you do in community. It's really simple. This is what you do in community. She had a profound influence, I think, on all of us. It wasn't until she was 84 that she had a stroke, and she ended up comatose for about 7-8 days. Then she died. She never really came out of the coma. In the coma, the only words she ever uttered were the words, "Don't forget to water them geraniums," which was a bit puzzling because she had a great garden but no geraniums. And we thought, who knows what's gone on in the brain? Something's dislodged. I was the eldest grandchild. I was about 23, and I was one that spoke at her funeral, which was a great honour. And it wasn't until a month after that my aunt, another daughter, like my mum, discovered a Henry Lawson story called Water Them Geraniums. The story of this widow, well, we don't know. She might have had a husband who just deserted and had gone droving, but she was on her own. This woman on her own, single mum, raising a tribe of kids, dirt poor. The story is told through the eyes of a rich selector, of this woman battling to clothe the kids, feed the kids, educate the kids, against the odds, the tragic missing male father in so much of early pioneer life. And the one thing this woman was inordinately proud of was her geraniums in her garden. Well, as Henry Lawson tells the story, tragedy strikes. A lot of Lawson's stories are melancholic. And this woman is dying. And as the reader, you're just paralysed with the thought, what was this like for her? Thinking, who will feed, clothe, educate these kids? No social security then, no safety net. What the panic going through her mind? She alone, the provider for them. The last scene of the Henry Lawson story is the kids gathered around her bed, and the last word she gives to her kids, "Don't forget to water them geraniums." When my aunt discovered that story, for me it was, well, my grandmother, even in a coma, never came out of the coma. She was passing on her values, reminding us it doesn't matter how much money you make, how much fame you have, how important you are. The measure of who you are is often the little things, the unseen things, the caring things, the pedestrian things, which probably no one's going to give you an Order of Australia for, but they reflect a deep sense of who you are, of where it comes from. I think so many of you are people who understand the importance of watering the geraniums, understand that this is more than just an activity, it's a calling. It's a sense that I must do this, that it's important to do this, that to share the solidarity is so important. Robert Kennedy said, "It's not more bigness that should be our goal. We must attempt rather to bring people back to the warmth of community, to the worth of individual effort and responsibility, and of individuals working together as a community to better their lives and their children's future. I think Robert Kennedy named what's really important. We have had 23 years of economic growth in this country, and yet it's often as if we're obsessed saying the meaning is more material, more growth. We know what the meaning is. The meaning is richer, deeper relationships. Being able to live out my deepest heart hungers, my deepest values, as my grandmother did. That's where meaning comes from. And here's a little tip. Humans always say the purpose of life is to be happy. Much more important than happiness is meaning. That's much more important. To have purpose, to have meaning, happiness comes along as a byproduct when you are clear about that. I just want to finish with one story. It's called the Rosetta phenomenon. In the early 1960s, scientists began studying a remarkable phenomenon in the little town of Rosetta. That's in Oklahoma, America. It's a town of 1,600 Italian Americans. Every home in town had 3 generations living in it. The sense of community was very strong. Teams of medical researchers spent time in Rosetta trying to determine why the rate of heart attacks was so much lower than neighbouring towns. Was it diet? No, the Rosettans shared a typical American diet. Was it genes? No, other Italian communities had heart attack rates similar to the national average. Was it healthy habits? No. Rosettans smoked and drank as much as people in neighbouring towns and exercised as little as people in the neighbouring towns. In fact, they were the same national average for obesity and high blood pressure. Was it the physical environment? No, there was no significant difference between Rosetta and neighbouring towns. Was it just a statistical anomaly? No, because the trend held up for over 50 years, defying statistics. In the end, health officials tracked the secret to good health in Rosetta to this: a close sense of community, very strong bonds of family and friendship. The head of the research team wrote in his report, in terms of preventing heart disease, it's possible that morale is much more important than jogging or not eating better. Interestingly, the initial research team predicted that health benefits would diminish as successive generations Americanized, meaning lost their tight-knit sense of community. Sadly, this prediction was accurate. Future generations who didn't invest in their community like their parents, Rosetta eventually became just like any other American town. Whether we think about it in individual terms, in community terms, neighbourhood houses should aspire to being the Rosettos here in Tasmania. And you individually, you should hear the message. Whatever you do, don't forget to water them geraniums. Thank you.